Good afternoon, everyone. Thankful for you being a part of this next installment of our daily Devo series. Hope that you have gone back, maybe perhaps, and sort of watched some of these other Christian evidences, ones leading up even through last night as we talked about the God question. We are going to kind of continue that, sort of wrap that up, hopefully, at least this particular part of the discussion about God's existence today. And we'll sort of move on. We'll come back to this question because ultimately this is the foundational question of all Christian evidences discussions, and that is starting with, can you even agree upon the existence of God? If you can, then the truth of the matter is you can at least begin to build off of that as you go. If you can't even agree on the existence of God, then how are you going to start talking about what it means to follow His will for your life and those kinds of things if you can't even exist on Him being real? So it is very important. We'll cover that in just a moment further in depth. But before we do, for our third graders and through sixth graders, third grader through sixth graders, we do want to encourage them in this kind of Q&A type thing we've been doing with them. So ask your third through sixth grader, what are three things that they know about Isaac? We've covered creation, we've covered Adam and Eve in that regard, we covered Cain and Abel, we covered the flood and Noah, we've covered Abraham, and now we ask, what are three things you know about Isaac? This one might be a little more difficult because, truth be told, there's not a whole lot of information that we have about Isaac, at least as far as some real specific things. We know some things about him, but maybe we don't know just a whole lot about him. And so this might be a great opportunity, an open door for you to talk with your third through sixth graders about who Isaac is and his representation throughout Scripture, because it's there, and it'll be important, and it would be valuable for you to cover that with your child. But we are going to move on, and we're going to talk about our next section here when it comes to the idea of evidence. We talked about last night at the outset of our lesson that there would be this sort of commonly held belief by some that to study the existence of God is somewhat futile for the one who already believes in God. And I would tell you that I'm afraid that that's really a bad attitude to have about this. And just simply put, in the sense that we all need reassurance. No matter how much we believe in something, it is always helpful to be reassured in it. So, for instance, the old preacher story that's been told, I don't know, hundreds of times, concerned this gentleman who had written into a newspaper to an editorial. He had written an editorial, and he said, to whom it may concern, I am refusing to ever darken the door of a church building ever again, because I've been to church 20-something years, and I didn't get anything out of it. I don't remember one lesson. I don't remember one thing that was taught, and so I'm never going back. And the next week, this older gentleman wrote in response to that man's diatribe, and he said, I have been married to my wife for 50 plus years. Over the course of those 50 plus years, we have shared at least 2 meals a day with each other. And for the most part, she has prepared many of those meals herself. And I cannot tell you, I couldn't even remember probably 20% of those meals, maybe not even any, that I could remember exactly what we had and exactly how it was fixed, etc. He said, but I know this, I'm healthy, I am well fed, and I'm taken care of. And he said, he skipped down at the bottom and he said, and this is why I will never miss an opportunity to study God's Word. While I may not remember every last word of it, I know that it keeps me fed, it keeps me safe, it helps me, it gets me through life, and it keeps me moving forward. And that ultimately is sort of the idea that we want to take with the idea of studying Christian evidences, because I know that many of you listening to these, if you're taking the time to do so, and we're very, very much very honored that you would take some time to listen and be a part of this study. But I know that many of you probably don't need to have it proven to you that God exists. But The idea of being reassured, of knowing that what you know is right. There's benefit in that. There's help in that. There is growth in that. There is movement in that. Moving forward, not becoming stagnant or not falling backwards, but moving forward, even if it's just a small step forward. It's a step forward nonetheless. So, say all that to go to this particular slide. The importance of the question: why is it important then to study the existence of God? Well, there's two major reasons. One is what we would call an intrinsic reason, which is God is the being greater than anything that could be imagined or thought of. So that's, in and of itself, that's the reason why you study the existence of God, because God is that being that is greater than anything. We defined it last night, and we talked about in this quote from John Hick, the infinite, eternal, uncreated personal reality who has created all that exists other than himself and who has revealed himself to his human creatures as holy and living. That in and of itself is the reason to study the existence of God. But secondarily, this is more of an instrumental importance. That is, that God is foundational in the order of being. So not only is it important just from an intrinsic situation that you look at God and you say, yes, I need to know more about him, but also from an instrumental, so moving forward, pushing forward, piece by piece, and how we live, what we are, who we are, etc. God is foundational in the order of being. So for those of us who may be firm believers in God and in God being the creator of the world, the universe, etc., it's still important for us to come back and go, okay, I know that he exists, I fully believe that he exists, but let me go back through this again and just be reassured and be pushed forward another step. And maybe I pick up on something that was a question that I had heard before from someone else, or maybe it's a question that I have myself. Now, I'm going to try to put this very simply, and I appreciate Dr. David Leip. When he taught our Christian Evidences class, he was very good at sort of bringing the material right to where people like me could understand it. And so what I want to do is, I'm going to give you this list. There's two lists here. One is if God does not exist, and then the other is if God does exist. So hopefully this will help you. This will make things very simple for you, because your conversations with people concerning the existence of God, this is a great place to start, to be honest with you. Just simply ask them, well, okay, what does it mean if God does not exist? And they may have some answers for you, but you can provide them with these 6 answers. Okay, if God does not exist, number one, we are nothing but organized matter. That's all we are. There's no soul. There's no spirit. There's no nothing. You're just organized matter. Number 2, everything we are and do is the result of non-living, non-intelligent, non-purposed matter. To me, that one sort of hits home. Everyone desires for themselves to have a purpose. They desire for the world to mean something to them. They desire to feel like they are a part of something. No person wants to be referred to as unintelligent. No person wants to be referred to as unpurposed. And that's what we are. If God doesn't exist, we're basically just some matter that, sort of goes through life and sort of, we sort of move through life and we acclimate ourselves to different situations and we adapt. That's the word I was looking for. We adapt and we become this and we do that. And there's really no rhyme or reason for anything. Number 3, if God does not exist, then there is no real objective right or wrong or good or evil. We've made this comment before. It bears repeating here. Without good, you don't know what evil is. Without evil, you don't know what good is. We read Cain and Abel's story and we know immediately, well, Cain's a sinner, Cain's evil. But you think about it, in that moment, in that time, before sin entered the world, would that thought have ever crossed Cain's mind? If God does not exist, there's no real objective right or wrong. There's no real objective good or evil. Number 4, if God does not exist, no one has any real obligation to do anything or not do anything. I mean, what obligation, if there's no good or evil, if there's no right or wrong, then, I mean, truthfully, for what reason do you need to do anything, or for what reason should you stop doing something? I mean, I know this is an extreme, and I admit that up front, but if there is no God, if God does not exist, and there is no moral law, there is no moral compass to guide us in any way, shape, or form, then what's to stop me from basically killing someone to take what I want? I mean, to us, that sounds, I mean, that even hurts me to say that out loud, because we realize how wrong and evil that is. But if there's no God, then what's to stop a person from believing that or thinking that, going that direction? Number 5, physical death is the absolute end of us all. If God does not exist, man, then funerals become unbelievably sad. Unbelievably sad. Unbearable almost. To simply think about, well, that's it. That's it. I mean, there is nothing else. It's heartbreaking to think about that way. And number 6, no matter how we've acted, there will be no accounting. There will be no judgment. There will be no punishment. I mean, there's nothing. It's just the end of life. You just cease to exist. That's if God does not exist. These are the 6 things that are true if God does not exist. Now, you present that list to someone and you say, okay, if God does not exist, we're nothing but organized matter. Everything we are is the result of the non-living, non-intelligent, non-purposed. There's no real objective right or wrong, good or evil. No one has real obligation to do anything or not do anything. Physical death is the absolute end of us all. No matter how we've acted, there's no accountability, there's no judgment, there's no punishment. Therefore, there's just, it's nothing. And I know some of the arguments that you'll get back from that conversation. You'll hear people say things like, well, we know what's right and what's wrong. Well, the question is how? Because the government made laws. Okay, well, let's, just for the sake of argument, let's go back and look at those laws. Let's go back and look at the interpretation of those laws. I know that's a touchy subject right now. And are we certain that we want humanity determining for all other parts of humanity what they think is right or wrong? That seems kind of dangerous. Well, let's look at the other side then. If God does exist, number 1, we're more than organized matter. That's a beautiful thought to think about, right? We're more than just organized matter. We are a soul. We are a spirit. We matter to God, to use that word there in a different way. We matter to God. We are more than just a bunch of cells and a bunch of things kind of clumped together. We are more than that. We belong to God. We are created in His image. That's a beautiful picture, a beautiful thing to think about. Number 2, we're the result of purposed action on the part of God. God didn't just make you haphazardly. God didn't just form us accidentally or, just sort of surprisingly. Oh, whoops, here's some stuff that I made. Go back and read Genesis 1 again for review for you. You are the result of a purposed action by God. Number 3, there is real objective right and wrong. There's good and evil. We understand it, we get it, we follow it, we abide by it. We know that if we don't do those things, that there's punishment coming. We get it. It keeps people in line. I mean, let's just be honest. There's the old discussion that was had between John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. They were sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum when it came to this idea of a social contract. John Locke, whose name might sound familiar to you if you studied your American history very carefully. You know that Thomas Jefferson basically took a lot of John Locke's principles, put them in the Declaration of Independence, which is sort of irony at its highest, as John Locke was an English philosopher, a British philosopher, and here was Thomas Jefferson writing to remove the United States from Britain's leadership, and he's using one of Britain's own philosophers. It's just sort of irony at its highest level. But John Locke was what we would call sort of an optimist. He believed that people were born inherently trying to do right. It's sort of pre-programmed in you to do good, to do right, to do what's honorable, and that ultimately you sort of cede some of your freedoms because you want to make sure everyone's taken care of. No, not socialism. No, not fascism. No, not communism. It's the idea of compassion for your fellow man, and you want to do whatever you can to help your fellow man get along, get by, whatever. Thomas Hobbes was on the opposite end of that spectrum. Thomas Hobbes was what we would refer to sort of as a pessimist, and he believed that all humans were sort of born evil and terrible and horrible, and that if they were left to their own devices, that life would be nasty, brutish, and short. That's his quote. And he said that people entered into a social contract of sort of protection because they understood how evil and terrible and awful they were. And therefore they sought the government and they sought this higher authority to protect them from the evil that is within every person. Well, either way you lean there, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, if you side with Thomas Hobbes, you say people are just naturally terrible. How do we know that? I mean, what tells us that they're quote unquote terrible? Well, if you side with John Locke and you say, well, yeah, everybody is trying to do what's right. I firmly believe that. I think people are inherently good. Okay, well, where does that come from? Where does that come from? I mean, if ultimately at the end of the day you are either good or bad, whichever way you lean in that particular argument, where did it come from? And that's a question that many atheists cannot answer. They trace it back to certain things, that and this, that, and the other. But ultimately, it just can't come. It's the same reason for the existence of our universe, which we talked about at length last night. If God does exist, we have a real obligation to obey the will of God. Now that's a challenge. That's a challenge that you have to put down and you have to push out for people. That is, hey, listen here. Here's the bottom line. If you believe that God exists, then that means that you have an obligation to obey His will. Because of that, these last two sort of tie in. Each one of us will live on as a unique center of personality after this life is over, and each of us must give an account to God for how he or she has lived. Ultimately, it's very important for you to understand what it means, what it implies, and truly what foundationally it does for you to have this discussion and believe about God existing. Or when you talk to someone who says, well, I don't think God exists, well, then you need to explain to them these things and say, look, this is what it means. This is what it means. If God does not exist, then this. And I'm telling you, I think I'm sort of a John Locke kind of follower in that particular sense, because I do believe that people naturally want to do good. I don't think that naturally people are born to do evil. So I think when you stress to people, hey, look, this is what it means if God does not exist, then I think you're going to find some ground that you can work on. And certainly when you start explaining what it means for God to exist, and the idea of purpose, and the idea of, as we said, you're more than organized matter. And eventually you'll get to this discussion about the obligation to obey the will of God, those kinds of things. You'll get to that eventually, but I think it's vital that you talk to a person who is struggling maybe in their belief and say, well, okay, if God does not exist, then here's what that means. I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful that you've been tuning in. I know it's difficult, maybe perhaps every night, to try to tune in for 15 or 20 minutes, but I just want to encourage you here in the last few seconds before we close down for today. Think about all the things that are going on right now. Think about all the people that are talking about how much time they've had. And we're asking for 15 or 20 minutes each night to try to help you grow and help you in your faith and help you in your family. And that sort of changes the perspective of how much time that is trying to be invested here. So I want to encourage you in that. I just want to remind you that and challenge you that even though, yes, I know 15 to 20 minutes of listening to me talk is probably not your ideal thing. But it's not about the messenger, it's about the message. And I hope that this has been helpful to you. Look forward to continuing our study tomorrow night.